Spiritual high, never down. Christ is King, and you are bound. You'll fade me, but I come back. I've got my friends on the attack. So we sent her a little note.
Little Christian goth metal. I hope you enjoyed it. And here's a picture of this gentleman. Why might I be showing this gentleman today? Does anyone know? Is there any significance about the day? Yes, Mr. Kozlowski.
Start of Black History Month.
Yes, it's the start of Black History Month. So to honor Black History Month, I'm going to talk about some Black Americans, American Catholics who are on their way to sainthood. I'll talk about several people over the next few classes during the month. And I'll talk about this man in a moment, but I just wanted to, before I get into that, I wanted to remind you that tomorrow we have the quiz, the first quiz, which will be on Canvas. It's 50 questions, and it'll cover everything we've been discussing since the beginning of the course, except for the syllabus. I won't ask any questions about the lecture on the syllabus, but everything we've been discussing since the beginning of the course. You may use your notes, and 6 p.m. tomorrow evening, you will have access to it, and you'll be able to do it from 6 p.m. Friday evening until the next following Friday. So you have basically a week to get it done. So just so you know. I'll also put, hopefully today, put up something about the paper and about the discussion board on Canvas, so be aware of that, or to keep be looking for that. I think that's all I wanted to mention. Okay, so moving on. So this gentleman, his name is, I guess you can see here at the bottom, Venerable Pierre Toussaint. Venerable Pierre Toussaint. There are four levels to sainthood in the Catholic Church in the process. There's a process. You have to kind of prove that a person was holy enough to be declared a saint. The lowest level is when they open up the investigation into a person's life to see if they were a holy person to begin with, if they had a reputation for holiness. And at that point, they are called officially a servant of God. So servant of God John Doe is at that point. The person's not a saint yet, but they've opened the investigation. There's good evidence at that level that the person was a good and holy person, and might be, what's the word I'm looking for? Might be, no, it's not coming to me, but might be a saint, might have been a saint. Doesn't matter. The next level is venerable. which this gentleman, Pierre Toussaint, is at. Venerable means that he's able to be venerated, he's able to be honored. The first process has completed, and there is evidence that this person practiced holy virtue, the virtues of God, to a remarkable degree, and can now be honored in the church as a saint. After that is blessed. So the next stage, the next level up is blessed. And for that, you basically need a miracle. You need something supernatural to happen. There's still historical investigations there. They investigate the person's life, how they lived, any writings they left behind in these stages of servant of God and venerable. But when you get to the blessed stage, all that work has kind of been done for the most part, and you're really waiting for some sign from God. So you're looking for something that's truly a miracle, like someone has cancer and the cancer disappears or something like that, and it's not medically explainable. It can't be something that you can explain through science. It's something that the scientists cannot explain. And you also have to verify that the person was praying to that possible saint like Pierre Toussaint at the time. So there's a direct connection. It can't just be, oh, I lost my cancer, it disappeared miraculously, and I'll just ascribe it to Saint, Venerable Pierre, No, it has to be like, they placed a relic, like a bone of Saint or Venerable Pierre on your body, or they said 9 days of prayer, novena to Venerable Pierre, and asking for the cancer to be removed, and so there's a direct seems to be a direct causal link between prayer to this holy person and the miracle that occurs, and then that will bump you up, if it's verified, to blessed. Then you're waiting for another miracle, a second miracle, and that will bump you up to canonization, properly speaking, where you're declared officially a saint of the church, which means you can be universally honored in the church and stuff like that. So that's the structure of sainthood in the Catholic Church and how someone becomes a saint or is declared a saint. That doesn't mean that there aren't people that were not, it doesn't mean that there were people who were who were not saints just because they weren't canonized or declared saints by the church. Kind of think of it like the church's Hall of Fame, if you will, okay? There might have been people, men and women, who were extremely holy and were saintly people, and when they died, they went right straight to heaven, that we don't know about. And the church doesn't know about. That's possible. So this is more like an official approval of the person's life and offering the person as an example for how to live as a Christian. Okay, so he is at the second stage. He's not a servant of God. He is a venerable. He was born in 1766. And he died in 1853. He was born in Haiti. Born as a slave, I believe, He was born in Haiti, the island, or I should say the island, but the nation of Haiti. The whole island is called Santo Domingo in the Caribbean, and you have two countries on it. On one half you have Haiti, and on the other half you have the Dominican Republic. He was born on the Haiti side, I believe in slavery, and in 1787 he was brought to New York by his owners, the Berard family. The Berard family. And he trained as a hairdresser. You got to make some money, got to earn the bacon. So his training was as doing women's hair, which he was apparently very good at, and he became very successful in New York City. It allowed him to, because of course the only real people who could get their hair done professionally were people who had money, so he was hanging with some people in high society, even though he was a slave. After Mrs. Berard's husband's death, and the loss of their sugar plantation during a Haitian revolt. So apparently they had this plantation sugar and were making money off of that, but there was a revolt and they lost it. So they lost their source of income, and Mrs. Berard's husband died. Pierre Toussaint supported Mrs. Berard and her new husband, because she remarried, on his own income. Out of charity, out of Christian charity, to help her out. In 1807, Mrs. Burrard died, and Pierre Toussaint gets his freedom. So he's no longer enslaved. But here's the interesting thing. Pierre Toussaint was a married man, and he bought his wife's freedom, and he would even buy the freedom since he had the money. He was making good money as a hairdresser for the upper echelons of New York City's society. He would buy the freedom of other Africans as slaves in the region. And you remember, even though this is New York City, this is the 1700s and early 1800s, where slavery was still, even in the North, you could find slavery. But he never bought his own his own freedom from slavery, interestingly enough. I don't know why he didn't do that. He certainly had the means to do it. But he would buy out the slavery for others so that they could be free. He also gave donations to orphan schools, especially for black children, and he helped found the first French church in New York City, because if you know anything about the history of Haiti, it was colonized by France and was under the control of France, and they still speak a form of French, Haitian Creole, down in Haiti, which is really their national language, although the official language is still French of Haiti, but their national language really is Haitian Creole, which is kind of this simplified version of French. Spoken. It's beautiful language. I wish I could speak it fluently. But anyways, so there's that connection with France and with French people. So he helped found the first French church in New York City, kind of like a national church, where people could go of different, and they had these in those days. We'd have national churches like Polish churches and Irish churches, and here a French church where people could go and they could speak their language and celebrate their culture while also being Catholic. He was a hairdresser to the wife of Nathaniel Fish Moore, who was the president at the time of Columbia University, a very famous university in New York City. And this gentleman, Nathaniel Fish Moore, was an amateur photographer who's also neighbors to Toussaint, so they lived near each other in New York City. And it's this guy, Nathaniel Fish Moore, who was the president of Columbia University, who took our only picture of Venerable Pierre Toussaint. And here it is. So this is an actual photograph. I don't know if they would call it a photograph since it's so early, but I'll call it a photograph of him sitting there in his older ages, obviously. But there he is. So you have an actual photograph of this holy man who may have been a saint. I think he was a saint, and hopefully one day will be on the path to sainthood. It was only in 1991 that the Archdiocese of New York opened the cause for Pierre Toussaint. He was declared a servant of God, and then in 1996, I looked it up, 1996, His Holiness Pope St. John Paul II declared him a venerable. And there it's kind of stayed. I don't know why. There seems to be general agreement that he was a very holy man. I don't know why he's not a blessed or even a saint by now. But, there it is. Sometimes, what the thing is that a lot of people who become saints, and I'm not telling you anything out of turn or out of school here, but it is kind of a popularity contest. And a lot of the people who make it all the way to sainthood or even blessedhood are religious. They're members of religious orders like monks and nuns and brothers and friars, and they have the whole religious order behind them. So the religious order has money, it's got people, it's got manpower, so it can kind of push the cause in Rome. If you're a simple layman like Pierre Toussaint, you've only got maybe volunteers. There certainly is a promoter of the cause. There's a person who's devoted to, who's chosen to promote the cause of the saint in Rome. But, it's hard. It's tough. You got to rely on volunteers and people like that. You maybe don't have the same kind of apparatus as, a religious order might have, which, has enough. So that's, so you might notice when the church publishes a list of people who are going to be canonized each year when they have canonization ceremonies, a lot of them are nuns and priests and monks and stuff like that, and they're trying to include more lay people, more people who are the normal walk of life, but I think they still have a ways to go with that. And so I pray, this great and holy black man Pierre Toussaint, I ask for your prayers, Venerable Pierre, especially on all Black Catholics, that you will bless them in their faith and bless all of us in this faith and help you to teach this class well and do a good job. And please bless everyone in this class that we will do well in the class. Everyone will do well in their grades. Amen. Okay. Alrighty then. So we noted, yeah, because it was Mr. Coombs. Okay, but he's not here. We noticed that Jesus, according to his dates, was born before he was born. And I mentioned this at the end of class, and I just wanted to mention it again just so you understand me. But you have to understand, our Western calendar is based on the dates of Jesus. It's really a religious calendar. I mean, you can't swing a dead cat in our culture without hitting religion somewhere. I mean, even though maybe the modern world is not as religious as maybe previous generations, so it seems. Some might disagree. But, or at least religion doesn't seem to be as influential on culture and society as it once was. A lot of the things that we do and that we, interact with in our lives are religious, and our calendar is one of them. 2024 years since the birth of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. Our calendar is Christian. It was created by a monk named Dennis, called, the Latin name, called Dennis the Short. So apparently he was short, a short man. If you want the Latin, it's Dionysius Exiguus. He's called. Sometimes you'll see that name, Dennis, or you'll see just Dennis Exiguus, Dennis the Short. And he lived in the 6th century AD. In 525 AD is when he created this calendar. What date did he die on? I wrote that down. Let me get my notes here. Nope, that's not what I want. When did Dennis die? 544, excuse me, around 544. When he died. And what he did is he went through the records, the historical records that he had, and saw, the dates for when people, the dates as best as they could give them, because they didn't have a calendar back then. You would date things according to the rulers. So, in the 15th year of the Emperor Claudius or the Emperor Tiberius or something, or during the second consulship of so and so. A consul is a political leader of the ancient Roman government. And that's how you would date things. You would date it usually by the rulers, because they didn't have a calendar that you could just look at with days and months. I mean, they had months and stuff like that, and they had days to a certain extent, but they didn't really have years as we have it. So they had to, do it. So the Romans dated everything from the foundation of the city of Rome, this legendary date when they believed that their city was founded. So that's what he had to work with. And so Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Short, went through these records and tried to figure out generally, as accurately as possible as he could, when Jesus must have been born, who was ruler of the Roman Empire, who the leaders of the Roman government were at the time. And he created this calendar dating system based on the incarnation of Jesus. So it was AD. He didn't do BC yet. He didn't think of that even. Just thought of Anno Domini, the AD, Year of the Lord. So he's the one who gives us that dating system of AD. But due to the historical uncertainties in his information, people might have gotten some of the dates or the years wrong when people were leaders of the Roman government and stuff like that. It wasn't perfect. He was off on his calculation by a few years. And so that's how we arrive at the fact that Jesus was born before Jesus. Christ was born before Christ. Jesus was born probably around 6 BC. Why did I do that? Oops. Oops. Okay. That's not the right PowerPoint. I forgot to update my PowerPoint. Oh well. Wondering what I want to do about that. Do I want to do that? Or do I want to... Hold on one second. I forgot to update the PowerPoint, but I've got the other one here on my flash drive, so let me use that just so I'm not confusing anybody. There we go. Okay. I don't know why I opened it twice, but okay. That again. There we go. Okay. Well, apparently I didn't. Okay, that's fine. All right, just work with it. Before we talk more about Jesus, I have to say something about the Jews. All right? The most essential fact about Jesus Christ was that he was a Jewish man. He was a Palestinian Jew. And so Jesus must be seen from the perspective of Jewish religion and culture. Okay? The Christian belief, Christianity does not exist in a void. It comes from somewhere. And if you study world religions, then we talk about Judaism, and after I talk about Judaism, I talk about Christianity. Why? I do that because Christianity comes out of Judaism. Christianity accepts that God has revealed himself, or did reveal himself, to the people of Israel, to their ancestors, to their fathers and mothers, and that this revelation was passed on. And that Jesus is the fulfillment of this revelation to Israel. So Christianity stands in continuity with Judaism. It's not a break with Judaism, though many Jews would see it as such. But the church doesn't see it that way. It sees it as the succession of Judaism, not a break from Judaism. At the heart of the Jewish religion lies the belief that there exists a covenant between God and the people. A covenant, I'll give you the definition on the board, is a contractual agreement or relationship. Covenant equals a contractual agreement or relationship. So a contract. Oops. Agreement. The Hebrew word that we find in the Bible is berit, to describe this word, this covenant. And berit in Hebrew means a bond, a fetter, a chain. A bond, a fetter, or a chain, okay? Think of like handcuffs. It's something that binds you together, okay? Or it's something that binds you to somebody else. You're bound by this covenant. According to Bernhard Anderson, who wrote the article on covenant in the Oxford Commentary on the Bible, something I looked up and looked into and took notes from, quote, "A covenant signifies a relationship based on commitment, which includes both promises and obligations, and which has the quality of reliability and durability." Okay, so it's like any kind of contract. The two parties say what they're going to do for each other. There are promises, say, I'll do this for you and you do this for me. There are obligations. You're obligated by the contract to do those things. And it's reliable and durable. It's reliable. There are witnesses to the contract and say, yes, I saw you sign and make the contract and sign the contract, so you can't get out of it if you try to say later, no, it wasn't me. and it's durable, it's binding, it's lasting. It's lasting. So there's a belief that God has made this kind of relationship with the people of Israel. He has obligated himself to the Jews by a covenant. How? He enters into a special relationship with their primordial ancestor, their first ancestor, this man called Abram, this ancient ancestor of the Jews, believed to be the father of the Jews, Abram. Also known as Abraham, but some people see it as a name change, like God changes his name to Abraham, but really Abram and Abraham are variations of the same name, okay? So there's really no difference. So you can call him Abram, you can call him Abraham. I'll generally call him Abraham. That's usually what he's called. Anyways, God enters into this special relationship with Abraham, the ancient ancestor of the Jews, and promises to make him a great family of people, to give him land, to give him a place to live, and to make him the father of a great family of people, a great nation, which God does eventually. So Abraham has children. He begins to have a family. We have Abraham, or Abram. He has a son called Isaac. Actually, he has two sons. His first son, actually, Isaac is not his first son. His first son is, what's his name? Ishmael, but we'll talk about Ishmael. If we were Muslims, we would talk about Ishmael, because Muslims believe that they descend from Abraham's son Ishmael, interestingly enough. The Jews come from Isaac. But we're not Muslims, so we're not going to talk about that. Abraham, Isaac, I do talk about it in both religions, though. Abraham, Isaac, and then Isaac has a son who is Abraham's grandson called Jacob. Why is this important? Because Isaac we can kind of forget about. If you read the stories, if you want to read about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you can read in the first book of the Bible called the book of Genesis. It gives all the story about them. Isaac is kind of a filler figure. He's kind of a bridge between Abraham and this man Jacob, his grandson. And as important as Abraham is, because God reveals himself first to Abraham and chooses him and selects him out of all the people in the world, Jacob is even more important than Abraham. Because God will later come to Jacob and will renew his covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac. He will renew it with Jacob. And in the case of Jacob, God does change his name. He says, you'll no longer be called Jacob, you will be called Israel. Which is a Hebrew, if you translate it into English, means God rules. You could also translate it as God is the ruler. God is the ruler, but general translation is God rules. Hence we have the people of Israel, the sons and daughters of Israel, or the Israelites, or aka the Jews, modern day Jews. So it's interesting because they're not called Abrahamites. They're not called the sons and daughters of Abraham, although he is their ancient ancestor. They're called the people of Israel. I mean, they even named their modern country the nation-state of Israel, okay? So Israel is not the name of a nation or a country. It's the name of a man, Jacob. Jacob, who is also known as Israel, with whom God has renewed his covenant. Covenant is a novel element in Israel's religion. It's not that you didn't have the idea of covenant in the surrounding cultures of the ancient Near East, which the Jews were a part of, but it's novel and new and fresh in how they reinterpret it to now. This is how they define their relationship with God. So it's a novel element in their religion because the people are bound not to a ruler. It's not a covenant with a ruler. It's a covenant with God himself, their God. So God makes an exclusive claim upon the Israelites' loyalty in their worship and social life. They're to worship God alone, this God who's revealed himself, and to live by the laws, the rules that this God will give to them. The belief and the affirmation of God's special relationship with Abraham, and his descendants, especially Jacob, Israel, lies at the heart of the Jewish religion. I mean, to understand the Jewish religion, if you want it in a nutshell, it's the covenant with God, the special relationship that of all the peoples of the world, we Jews have with the God of the universe. The Jews eventually did become a great nation of families. They talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, but you could also say the 12 families of Israel. They're basically an amalgamation of different families amongst these people who are all descended from this man Abraham. And they do become a great nation of families and even establish their own kingdom in the Eastern Mediterranean. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. Can't see it well. There you go. There it is. So if we go to our map, and we go over to the Middle East, or the Near East, it could be called, all the way over here, they do modern state of Israel, and they did establish a kingdom here in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. But that kingdom was eventually destroyed. It was invaded by other powers that were larger and more powerful than the Jews were in their small kingdom. And so their little kingdom got destroyed. And many of the Jews were exiled, dispersed throughout the world, throughout the other parts of the Mediterranean, other areas in the Middle East. But the Jews eventually came to believe that God would remember his covenant, because it seemed like everything was over. I mean, the kingdom was gone. The Jews were dispersed throughout the world. There are a few Jews maybe left in Israel, the land of Israel, but many Jews, if not most Jews, have been dispersed throughout the rest of the world, and maybe even lost, just kind of melded into the local cultures and were lost. But the Jews believed that God would remember his covenant with Israel and send them a king savior, a Messiah, a Christ, who would restore the fallen kingdom, reestablish the true following of the law of Moses, the laws and the rules and commandments that God had given to them, because it wasn't always possible to do so because, well, their kingdom was destroyed and their temple was destroyed. Their place of worship was destroyed, so they couldn't worship God properly anymore. So this king savior would reestablish that, and this king savior would inaugurate a reign of peace for the people of Israel. It would call them back to their homeland in Israel, and they would live there peacefully. This figure is called, as I told you, the Messiah, or in Greek, the Christ. Okay, we already looked at that when we went over I shouldn't say the name of Jesus Christ, but how Jesus is called Jesus the Christ. We'll talk more about the Messiah later, but what I want to talk about is that Christianity proclaims that Jesus of Nazareth is God's response to his relationship with Israel. He is the fulfillment of all God's revelation to the Jews and all the covenants God has made with them. Jesus is the new and definitive covenant between God and Israel. And so we need to remember the Jews are not just actors or characters in a kind of sacred drama, that as soon as, God chooses these people as a means to an end, as soon as Jesus appears, and Christians believe Jesus appears, and God has fulfilled his covenants with Israel, the Jews can kind of be shuffled off to the side. And that's sometimes how Christians kind of treat Judaism. It is a separate religion, and it's very different from Christianity. It's not the same, obviously, and there are divergences. But for Christianity, Judaism is still essential. It's not as if as soon as God met his purposes that the Jews would cease to have any importance or role for God or would move off the stage, in a manner of speaking. God's covenants with the Jews were not just means to an end. They weren't just a necessary bridge to get us on the way to Jesus, though they are that too. And they are, in a sense, leading to fulfillment. They're to be fulfilled in something, and Christians believe they're fulfilled in Jesus the Christ. But that doesn't mean that God is not still concerned about the Jews, or that the covenants are irrelevant to them. The previous covenants are irrelevant to them. The church proclaims Jesus as the fulfillment of God's covenants. This is an important point. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's covenants with Israel, with the Israelites, not with the Gentiles. Most Christians nowadays are what we would call Gentiles, non-Jews. The nations is how the Jews refer to those who are not Jewish. You have Jews, and then you have the Goyim, the nations. Most Christians are from the Goyim, Goy, okay, and it's a nation. Those are the nations. It's the plural Goyim. I mean, most Christians are Gentiles. They're not of Jewish lineage at all. And yet they proclaim their belief in the Jewish Messiah. They read the Jewish scriptures. They celebrate Jewish holidays. Passover and Easter are the same at the same time period, and they're basically the same kind of thing. Easter is the Christian Passover. They honor the same people: Moses, Abraham, David, all figures from Jewish history. Of course, Jesus is a Jew. Mary's a Jew. The apostles were Jews. And yet they're being worshipped. I should say they're being worshipped. Jesus is being worshipped. Or they're being honored, in the case of the saints like Mary and the apostles, by non-Jews. So while for Christians, the Jews and God's covenants with them do not make complete sense without Jesus, who is seen as the fulfillment of those covenants, neither does Jesus make complete sense without them. You will not understand the Christian faith or Jesus without understanding where he came from, his roots in the Jewish religion and amongst the Jewish people, because he's the fulfillment of their hopes. So those of us who are Gentile or non-Jewish believers in Jesus and members of his holy church are only those things on account of the Jews. No Jews, no Jesus, no church, no Christianity. So non-Jews have benefited from the covenants through Jesus, the Messiah of the Jews. As St. Paul says, this man Paul, if you look in your Bible, the letter to the Romans, chapter 11, verse 16 and following, Romans 11, 16 and FF following verses. In fact, I think I'll read that. Or does someone want to read that for me from the letter to the Romans? Chapter 11, beginning with verse 16. Yes, Mr. Zayas Bazan. Go ahead, sir. Yes.
First fruits are holy, so is the production of so on the branches.
Keep going.
But if some of the branches were withdrawn, and you, wild olive trees, were grafted in their place and put to shade in the tree of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. If you do boast, consider that you do not support the supports you.
Okay, that's fine. Excellent. What is Paul talking about here? He's writing to the church in Rome, and probably a mixed community of Jews and Gentiles, non-Jews. And he's speaking here to the non-Jews, and he's basically warning them, don't think that you're better than the Jews or look down on your fellow Christians of Jewish descent because, you think, well, they missed Jesus. They didn't, the Jewish people as a group kind of rejected Jesus in a way. They didn't realize he was the Messiah, or they don't accept him as the Messiah. And so we need to move on from Judaism. We kind of look down on Judaism, something like it was second-rate revelation or something like that. And Paul is saying, no, remember that just as he uses the image of making bread, And just as the I guess, if you make bread, you put the flour and the eggs and the milk and stuff, and you mix it all and you knead it and stuff like that. And just like the first fruits, the stuff you're first working with, the flour, the eggs and stuff to make the bread, are good, obviously, because you're using them. So is the whole batch of dough. It doesn't suddenly become better bread because it's later, because you have the full bread that's, risen and is ready to bake. That's the image he's kind of using with the Gentiles. But then he uses another image, which is maybe clearer to understand. He compares the Jews to the root of a tree. The Jews are the root of this holy tree that God has planted. And you Gentiles, you non-Jews, are like twigs, little bits of a plant that you might graft on. You might cut the plant and then graft on a twig from another plant that will grow in place and grow onto the original plant or tree. Okay, this is what people do all the time. Horticulturalists do this. So he's using this horticultural example. You're a wild olive branch. Okay, you're something wild. You're not a cultivated tree like the Jews are. The Jews have been prepared by God through his revelation. But you Gentiles, you non-Jews, you're idolaters, you're worshiping idols, worshiping false gods, doing what you do in your own false religions, or not true religions, not the full truth, one should say. And now you've come to the fullness of truth, but you only found the fullness of truth through the holy people of Israel. So don't boast. Don't think you're better than them because you found Jesus, and many of the Jews have not found him yet, is what Paul is saying. Who is it? Paul is a Jew. Okay, remember, you have been grafted onto the holy root. And the root supports you. You don't support the root. Okay, so it's a mystery for Paul, because even Paul as a Jew doesn't really understand why many of his fellow Jews... Oh, Ms. Don't tell me. See you coming. Oh, yes, Ms. Moore. Sorry. I was going to say Ms. Moore, but then I had a brain freeze. Okay. Such. Okay, good. What was I saying? So don't boast in them. See yourself, because the root is supporting you. And it was a mystery for Paul as a Jew why most of his fellow Jews did not accept Jesus as the Christ, when for Paul it was so obvious Jesus was the Messiah. He was the fulfillment of God's covenant or promise of a king savior. But nevertheless, he said, even though that's a mystery, and basically let God sort it out. God, Paul holds out this hope that eventually the Jews will one day accept Jesus as the Christ. But at this point in time, when he's writing this letter, probably the 60s AD, it hasn't happened. He doesn't know why, but he's telling the Gentiles, beware, don't get prideful, because you're the wild olive branches that have been grafted onto the good plant, the holy root. So the Jews are the holy root from which you're drawing your sap. So this is, why did I go over this? Because this is an important point, because as I said before, and I'll say it again, you don't understand Christianity, the Christian faith, or Jesus without understanding where he came from, the Jews. Jesus was a Jewish man, so he thought like a Jew. He argued like a Jew. He assumed the truth of the Jewish religion. Okay, he read the Jewish sacred writings. He went to the temple and worshipped at the temple. Okay, he prayed to the God of Israel. So, Jesus was not a Christian. I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus, the Jew, who started Christianity. Okay? How do we know about Jesus? What are some historical... where's our historical information, or where does our historical information about Jesus come from? Wanted to mention that. Maybe I'll talk about that next time. We do have our best historical information. Well, there are three sources. I should put this up before I go on to that. There are three sources that we have. I'll start with the oldest first. Our oldest sources for some historical information about Jesus of Nazareth come from this man, Paul, that I've mentioned, who was a Jewish follower. He was a rabbi. and I will talk more in depth about Paul when I talk about the apostles. He was later an apostle, chosen. He had a vision of Jesus, and he assumed from that he had been chosen by Jesus to be an apostle. Okay, and Paul is writing. Let's see if I can remember Paul's dates in 480 to 65. So Paul is writing letters to Christian communities between 50 and 65 AD. So that's our first historical source, the letters of Paul, which are only found in the New Testament in the Bible. Our second source are these books called Gospels. Hopefully by now you've read one of them, the Gospel of Mark, and you've read portions of the Gospel of Matthew. But these Gospels, which are a genre, a type of Christian literature that contains the details of Jesus' ministry. Okay, they're not history books, and we'll talk more when we talk about the Bible in another class. We'll get more in depth about what the Gospels are, but they're not history books. In fact, scholars still kind of debate what kind of genre of literature this is, because it doesn't really fit neatly into any type of genre. It's not really a history book, and some people think that maybe it's a story of you had certain books. What were they called? Paratologies, I think was the name they used for it. But anyways. You had books that were produced in the ancient world about famous people, which just contains little stories of them, usually working wonders or having dialogues with people and making giving their teachings and usually surprising people with what they say. Like you have a little debate and then there's a back and forth, and then the main person in the writing will give some punchline, some final statement which ends the whole debate, and everyone's astonished and yes, what a genius, what a wise man, and stuff like that. So you had books where there were collections of stories like that, and maybe the Gospels fit into that because you kind of see those kinds of stories in the Gospels: Jesus working miracles, Jesus having little debates with people where he kind of ends the debate with a little pithy statement that shuts everybody up. And stuff like that. But still, even with that, the Gospels don't fit neatly even into that genre. So it's still a debate of what the Gospels kind of are. I guess the best way to understand them is that they just wanted to give stories that people remembered about Jesus from his ministry. That's what they're mainly concerned with. They want to preach the good news. That's what gospel means in English. It comes from a Greek word which means good news or good message. They want to get out the message. Remember, sacred tradition and sacred scripture. The Christians were preaching their message before they were writing it down. They did have scriptures, if you remember. They had the Jewish sacred writings, and they would argue from those writings. And of course, those writings don't mention anything about Jesus of Nazareth because they came before he lived. But they would interpret them. Again, there was interpretation, magisterium going on of these Jewish sacred writings. And they would talk about them. And they would bring into play the stories they had of Jesus, which they would tell these stories. And eventually, this is the good news. They want to talk about the good news of Jesus, of God's revelation in Jesus. So the Gospels, eventually this good news gets written down, and we have a gospel, a book. And there are 4 of them, and I give them here on the PowerPoint. There's one ascribed to Matthew, another to Mark, another to Luke, and to John. That's the order that you'll find traditionally in the New Testament in your Bibles. It's not the order they were written. If you're curious about when and how they were written, we'll talk more about that in the Bible class. But right now, all you need to know is there are 4 of them ascribed to these men: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who we don't really know who they are. They're just names that are ascribed to them. And they contain the details of Jesus' ministry. And then third, we have a reference outside of Christian writings by this Jewish historian called Josephus Flavius. In a book that he wrote called The Antiquities of the Jews. I could probably do that. Maybe I should. Jews, which I believe was written around 94 AD. I didn't write the dates for the Gospels on the board, and I should have mentioned them. I apologize because I have them here in the PowerPoint. These 4 Gospels date from a range from 60 to 100 AD, and the Antiquities of the Jews by historian Josephus Flavius, if I remember correctly, was written in 94 AD. Should have done this before. Now, what does that mean, and what kind of book was it? He wrote a number of histories, and Josephus was writing for the Romans, for Roman readers, non-Jewish readers, and he was basically in the Antiquities trying to explain the Jews and where they came from. Antiquity comes from the word for, antiquated or antique, old, something old. So the old periods of the Jews, he starts with the beginning of the world, and he works his way up to the present time when he was living, just giving the history of the Jews to kind of show the Romans that, hey, we have a long history too, as long as, and maybe even longer than you Romans do, stretching all the way back to the beginning of the world. I'm just doing something here. And in the process of telling that story, he mentions some people from the Christian story. He mentions a man named John the Baptist. He mentions a man named James, who was a brother of Jesus of Nazareth, and he mentions Jesus. He briefly mentions Jesus of Nazareth as well. And so that gives us, outside of Paul's letters and these 4 Gospels, that gives us really our only only outside evidence from the religious writings of the historical evidence of Jesus, that he existed, and gives us some details about his life. Okay. Just checking something on my computer. I just wanted to... Okay, there we are. Okay, let's see if that works. Because I want to talk about this, so I want to be able to show it to you. Okay, so I have it here on my flash drive. There we go. This is what I wanted. The Jews, covenant, and Abraham. I think I did put this on Canvas, but I'll have to check. But Paul of Tarsus. Okay, so I put this on the board, so you're not missing anything. His letters 50 to 65, I gave you to that. That's an interesting picture because it's our earliest picture that we have of Paul of Tarsus. Now, it's probably, who knows if that's what he actually looked like. But already there was a kind of a stereotypical way that they would paint the portrait of Paul of Tarsus with the bald head and this long pointy beard. And archaeologists were digging somewhere. Where is it? Catacombs? Yeah, catacombs, which are underground cemeteries that I told you about. These are the catacombs of St. Thecla in Rome. And they found the most ancient portrait of what someone thought St. Paul of Tarsus looked like. So there it is. I thought I'd show it to you. But that's how you would know it was Paul. St. Peter is always shown with short hair and a short beard and white. So he has gray hair. And Paul is bald with a pointy beard. Okay, here we go. Because I want to talk about this. The reference to Jesus that's in the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus is called the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius, okay, according to his family name, Josephus Flavius. You'll also see him called Flavius Josephus. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter. I just thought this was interesting, so I wanted to talk about it because it is outside of, the Christian religious writings. It's our only truly, we can say, truly historical view of Jesus that we have, and an outsider view because he was not a Christian. He was a Jew. He was not a follower of Christianity. And it's a very brief reference. Does anyone want to read this reference from the Testimonium Flavianum in Antiquities of the Jews? Ms. Riera, go ahead.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, he was a teacher of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him the defense of Jesus as he was the Christ, and was pilot of the suggestion of the principal mathematics and academic reforms. Those that loved him out of the thirst to know. He appeared to them alive and because the divine prophets 10,000 of the tribe of Christians, so named are not extinct.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So if you want to find this Antiquities of the Jews, or Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3, and yes, as I told you, it was written around 94 AD. His dates are 37 AD to 100. So he was not a contemporary of Jesus at the time, because Jesus left the earth around 33 AD, okay? But I guess we'll say close enough. All right, well, this is interesting. And you can see it's a rather brief reference to Jesus. Why are some things in red? Because scholars believe that probably, some say all of it, but most scholars would say some of it is probably not by Josephus, was added by a later Christian scribe who, when he was copying Josephus' works, he had to do. He didn't have printing presses and stuff like that, so he had to copy books by hand. That some Christian scribe or secretary maybe inserted some extra details into what Josephus wrote. And so I put those portions that most scholars agree on is probably not by Josephus in red. The rest of it in blue is probably legitimate. Personally, I think the whole thing's legitimate, and I'm going to tell you why. But interesting, okay? Notice it's not very long. It's quite brief. And it just is kind of inserted into the story. Josephus is talking about this man, Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of the region. And in the midst of talking about that, he says, oh, by the way, there was this wise man, Jesus. And he gives us a little historical detail about him. He affirms, there's nothing wrong with him saying Jesus was a wise man if Jesus was some sort of holy figure or wise figure. I don't think, as a Jew, there would have any problem admitting that if Jesus was presenting himself as a wise man or a holy man within the Jewish religion. I don't think so. The phrase that if it be lawful to call him a man sounds like he's saying Jesus was more than a man. And does Josephus mean that he's saying Jesus was a god? He was divine? I don't know. It's hard to interpret it because it is in some ways ambiguous. It could be tied into what he says after that is it lawful to call him a man because he worked miracles. And just about everybody agreed that Jesus was a miracle worker. It's one of the most well-established historical facts we have about Jesus. Doesn't mean he actually worked miracles. I mean, if you don't believe in miracles, if you think there were natural explanations, that's fine. But the historical fact, history isn't dealing with whether he did them or not. That's not the question. The question is, what was the reputation of Jesus? And everyone agreed that he was a wonder worker. He had that reputation, whether you believe in miracles or not. So, yeah, I could see Josephus saying, even though most scholars might think a Christian was, hinting at Jesus' divinity there, not necessarily so. I think that Josephus might be referring to the next statement of, as a wonder worker, he seemed to be doing things, or be able to do things that normal human beings could. So it was like he was more than just a human being, because he could work all these wonderful deeds. Okay? He was a teacher of truth, so wise man. He was a wisdom teacher, so Jesus was a teacher, interestingly enough. And he had followers, so he brought over many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. Actually, in this translation, Gentiles, the word used here in the Greek language that Josephus wrote in is not Gentile, he uses the word Greek. So Jesus brought over many of the Jews and many of the Greeks, is what it literally says. Why is that important? Because a Gentile is specifically a non-Jew. But Greek is not necessarily. Again, Greek is ambiguous because you can talk about at that time Jews who spoke Hebrew and Jews who spoke Greek. Jews who lived throughout the Mediterranean and no longer spoke Hebrew, and they were Greek-speaking Jews. And sometimes they're called Greeks, even though technically, ethnically, they're not Greeks. They're Jews, okay? But they speak Greek, so they're called Greeks. So this could be, again, a little bit ambiguous. It might mean that Jesus had followers amongst the Jews, meaning those who lived in Palestine, the Hebrew-speaking Jews, but also amongst the larger population of Jews throughout the Mediterranean, possibly, okay? If he does mean non-Jews, then that's interesting. That's an interesting detail, because if you read the Gospels, and if you've read the Gospel of Mark by now, you know this. Really, Jesus did not, there's no indication from the four Gospels that Jesus did have a large following of non-Jews. He knew non-Jews and had some interaction with non-Jews. But Jesus, at least in the Gospel of Matthew, is very specific that I have come for the lost sheep of Israel. I haven't come for non-Jews. And in his interactions, it's mostly with people, Israelites, with people who are Jews. So could this be a slip? Maybe this is an addition, this portion is an addition by a Christian scribe who knows what came after, where, yes, Jesus came to the Jews, but afterwards a lot of non-Jews entered into the church, entered into belief in Jesus, and so it kind of slips here and from his own knowledge of, but forgets the gospel story where Jesus doesn't seem to have any followers from amongst the non-Jews, and says many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. Maybe, possibly. But from my understanding, most scholars think that statement is probably legitimate to Josephus. They don't find anything real shocking about that. The next statement they do, he was the Christ, and that might seem to be an obvious one. Josephus was not a Jew, Josephus was a Jew, he was not a Christian, so one can assume that he did not believe Jesus was the Messiah. He did not follow Jesus as the Messiah. So is it possible, is it probable that he would write such a statement that Jesus was the Christ? And this is where you kind of get into supposing, Can you suppose that Josephus would write something like this? Well, probably not, if he was not a Christian and did not believe Jesus was the Messiah. But I always think that, even though most scholars would reject that as an interpolation, an addition by a later Christian hand, I'm always suspicious when people tell me they know from someone they've never met, lived so long ago, they've never met, they've never talked to, that this person couldn't possibly have written something or done something. Because who knows? You weren't there, you know the person, you talked to the person, what's your evidence? The evidence is the person's opinion, their imagination. I can't imagine that Josephus would actually write this. But he does write it. It'd be one thing if you had other manuscripts and either the testimony wasn't there at all, or these portions were not there, and then you can see other manuscripts where all of a sudden they're there. That's evidence, but we don't have any evidence. All of our manuscripts of Josephus, from the earliest ones, have this just as it is, at least in the Greek. There are other versions that come later that are based off of the Greek, but in the original Greek, this is what we got. So you have to explain it, it's there. And I think when you look at the original Greek, it makes a little more sense. And I think that he could have, even though a lot of scholars would say no, that he could have said this. Because in the Greek, what it literally says is, that one was the Christ. It might not make a lot of difference to you, but you have to understand Judaism. When you're talking about an enemy, or someone you perceive as an enemy in the Jewish culture, you don't refer to them by name. You never refer to them by name. You don't even acknowledge their existence. So you don't say Jesus was the Christ if he's your enemy, or John. Let's say John. So this guy John is such and such. You don't even talk about the person. You refer to them as that one. I saw that one at the store today. And you kind of know that this is someone that you don't like. And it's part of the culture. And that's how it refers to Jesus. There is a Greek word for he. He could have said, which is autos. He could have said, he is the Christ, which is how they translate it. That's not literally what it says. It's that one was the Christ. I think you have to read between the lines here. I think it's a lot of what's going on in these statements that Josephus makes, especially at the end of the paragraph, are meant to be ironic. It's kind of like wink, wink, like, yeah, that one was the Christ. Yeah. Well, what happened to him? Did he overthrow the Romans as we expected the Christ to do? No, he got killed. As he says, he was nailed to the cross. However, he has followers. For he appeared to them alive again on the third day as the divine prophets. And again, I think this is ironic. I think Josephus could have written this. If you understand irony when you're reading, you can read between the lines. Because he doesn't just say, as the prophets foretold. Read what he really says. As the divine prophets, not just prophets, the prophets of God foretold these, and not just a few things about Jesus, one or two things about Jesus, 10,000 things about, and wonderful things about this man. It's like kind of going overboard in his praise for Jesus, a man he didn't believe in as the Christ. So I think there's irony going on here. And the tribe of the Christians still exists. This is another reason why I think, this portion is another reason why I think the section on, or the statement on he was the Christ is probably legit, because, he mentions the name of Christians, which he never explains what it means. It means the followers of the Christ. But if he doesn't mention that Jesus is the Christ in some way, the reader is kind of left with this puzzle at the end. Well, why are they Christians? Who are the Christians then? Why are they called Christians? Because they thought he was the Christ, the Messiah. There has to be some sort of explanation of what's going on. Notice also in this section, which a lot of scholars think is not original, but I do, he doesn't mention that Jesus rose from the dead. He doesn't mention resurrection. He just says that Jesus was seen alive on the third day, or again on the third day, which is again kind of ambiguous. Well, what does that mean? Jesus was seen alive again. He was nailed to the cross, but then he's alive again. Is it possible that he could have been taken down from the cross? It's not impossible. We do have stories from the ancient world where people survived on the cross. There's only one story that I know of a guy who survived on the cross for several days, and people were so impressed by it, they thought, well, he suffered enough, and they took him down. And he lived. He was alive. So it's ambiguous. I asked the question, come at it from a different point of view. I'm not asking so much, would Josephus the Jew write this, but if a Christian were going to put this in to Josephus the Jew's writing, would a Christian write this? It's because it's very restrained, and it's kind of ambiguous in some ways. Yes, it says Jesus was a miracle worker. Okay. Kind of hints a little bit that Jesus was more than a man, but it doesn't go so far to say he's the Son of God. It says he appeared alive to people, but not that he was raised from the dead by God. There are gaps that you might think that a Christian who's writing this might write a lot more. Again, I'm supposing now, but hey, if someone can suppose it's turnabout is fair play, I can do my supposing too. Wouldn't a Christian maybe want to write a little bit more of the story of Jesus? Okay. But there it is. Okay? So this is outside of the Gospels, outside of the writings of Paul, are only historical information. There are some other tidbits that we have in Roman historians later on about Jesus, but they're all secondhand. They're hearsay. They're things that they're told probably by Christians or other people about Jesus, and so they're not really directly. They're evidence that Jesus probably existed, but they don't tell us much about who he was or what people thought he was. And of course, Josephus had to be told as well, but this is really kind of, more closer to the point. It's 94 AD, so it's closer to the time of Jesus. And he's a Jew, so he understands the culture, whereas the Roman historians really wouldn't understand, did not understand Judaism. So what do we go back to? What we go back to really? Not even the letters of Paul, because the letters of Paul are not concerned with giving us historical details so much. We go back to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are our best and most detailed historical information we have about Jesus. They're our best information that we have about his activities. that are written by Christian believers several decades after his ministry. And so, I mean, they are religious texts, so they're not historical texts. So they have a point of view. So you know, in historical research, you kind of have to tease out what is the faith element from what is the more objective, historical, factual element of the case. But it can be done, and scholars try to do this. At least they try to do this, and it seems to be able to be done. Okay, things going off here. Okay, so I'll stop here, and I will talk to you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend. God bless you all. Oh, yes. Excuse me. You're welcome.
Have a good one.
You too, sir. Thank you. You're welcome, sir. Have a good day. Have a good day, sir. Thanks.
Bye,
Bye, miss. Have a good day.
Sorry about that. Sorry, Mike.
So,
When you were teaching that class, or I just kind of came in. I didn't realize this was an Egyptian class.
oh, okay, don't worry about it. Does that make any sense?
It's pretty similar to what we were talking about last time, but if we're talking about interesting stuff, or we going to
No, I think I'll save Hinduism for next week. I'll tell the classes, but I really don't feel like beginning this whole huge religion. Yeah, so we'll have a discussion. I'll finish up on Catholic Church religion. I'll have a discussion about it explains things. Okay. So I didn't go over it. Talk about it.
should be.
Hello, Miss. What am I doing here? Okay, I got this, I got that. What else do I got? Okay.